Depending on who you ask, Spy is either the strongest class in the game or the weakest. To some, Spy is an assassin that lurks in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and wipe out an entire team one by one. And to others, Spy is nothing more than a free kill. For most classes, their main weaknesses are hard-coded into the game. Pyro is strong in close quarters, but he's held back by his poor range. Heavy can take and dish out high amounts of damage, but he's limited by his poor mobility. Scout has insane mobility and DM potential, but he's kept in check by his frailty. For these classes, their strengths and weaknesses are decided by Valve, meaning the overall balance of the class is in their hands. If they want to buff Scout, they can try giving him more longevity. If they want to buff Heavy, they can try giving him an option for better mobility. And if they want to buff Pyro, they can try giving him a flamethrower with greater range. From there, Valve can continue to tweak the numbers until they feel that the class is balanced. But Valve can't do the same when it comes to Spy, because Spy's biggest weakness has nothing to do with him, but who he's up against. Spy's biggest weakness is the experience and awareness of other players. The player base's overall experience in catching spies is something that is both out of Valve's control and only increasing as time goes on. And so, throughout TF2's life, Valve has had a literal balancing act when it comes to Spy. On one hand, they need to give Spy enough tools to let him stand a chance versus experienced players that can see through his disguises. On the other hand, they need to make sure that Spy doesn't become too oppressive versus newer players. This dynamic makes looking back at Spy's balancing history fascinating. When it comes to trying to balance Spy, Valve has fallen flat on their faces. A lot. So, let's take a look at that history. Let's look at the evolution of Spy. You might be thinking that upon TF2's release, there was nothing stopping a Spy from top scoring effortlessly. And you'd be partially right. There was an abundance of new players that were too busy figuring out how to move and shoot to watch their backs. But there were also players who had already gained experience in identifying spies from playing Team Fortress Classic, TF2's predecessor. And even among those new players, they quickly began to pick up on some basic spy checking strategies. Shoot teammates you can't walk through, keep an eye on the kill feed, and if all else fails, go Pyro. So Spy on release was pretty good, but he was also buggy. For weeks, months, or even years after TF2's release, spies would continue to get healed by enemy medics even after losing their disguise. Cloaked and disguised spies would report their achievements to everyone else. Cloaked spies would have a particle beam effect while standing next to a dispenser. Team-colored teleporter effects would show up on invisible and disguised spies. Backstabbing someone while standing on top of them would result in fall damage. And I haven't even mentioned face stabs. Throughout TF2's early years, Valve made several attempts to fix face stabbing through various patches. Though, credit where credit's due, these patches weren't for nothing, as face stabs were much more common back then compared to today. So for the first year of TF2's life, that's the state that Spy remained in. A bit buggy, but still pretty strong against new players, which were plentiful at this point. Spy wouldn't get any noteworthy balance changes until December of 2008. As of this patch, spies could recharge their cloak via ammo pickups or health cabinets. Up until this point, spies would often sit in corners and just wait for their cloak to slowly recharge. Now, they could be much more active in their gameplay. In February of the following year, Valve made two major changes to backstabs in an attempt to fix face stabbing once and for all. First, backstabbing was changed to be instant, whereas before, there was a delay between clicking and the backstab actually registering, a delay that was even longer than with a normal knife swing. This was a great quality of life improvement, since that long delay could mean the difference between landing a backstab or getting spotted and killed beforehand. The second change was not as well received. The radius that determines whether a knife swing is a backstab or not was reduced from 180 degrees to 160 degrees. This change effectively removed sidestabbing, which more skilled spy mains had been utilizing to net backstabs more efficiently. And surprise surprise, face stabs were still happening even after these changes. 2 weeks later, the backstab radius was reverted back to 180 degrees once again, with the added bonus of Spy keeping his now instant backstabs. Spy mains at this point were feeling pretty good. Valve's been hard at work fixing, or trying to fix, the many bugs that have plagued Spy since release, and now they're even getting to some actual buffs. But recharging cloak and instant backstabs were nothing compared to what was next. After first being announced in April, the Sniper update officially began on May 12th with the reveal of the Huntsman. Day 3 of the update saw the reveal of the Razorback, to the chagrin of spy mains everywhere. But on the following day, it was revealed that the Sniper update was actually the Sniper vs. Spy update, with Spy receiving his first batch of unlockable weapons. Let's start with the least flashy of the three, the Cloak and Dagger. The Cloak and Dagger on release functioned nearly the same as it does today, with a few minor differences that we'll get to later. With its ability to allow for infinite cloak, this watch has always been a solid option for those that preferred waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Next, we have the Ambassador. The Ambassador on release was easily the worst unlock in the entire game. It only mini-crit on headshot, which barely made up for its minus 15% damage penalty. Thankfully, Valve bumped its mini-crit bonus up to a full critical hit just a few days later, resulting in that iconic 102 damage headshot. And this made the Ambassador absurdly broken because there was no cooldown between headshots. Once that cooldown was added on a month later, however, the Ambassador remained a popular choice for spy mains. It addressed a common complaint of Spy's revolver being too weak, but required precise aiming in order to achieve that greater damage. This need for precision also meant that the Ambassador was mostly used to eliminate a specific target, preferably before they noticed you, which fit Spy's role as a sneaky pick class. With the Ambassador, Spies could now two-shot light classes with a headshot followed by a body shot, most notably snipers using the newly released Razorback. This gave Spy a surprisingly high potential damage output, though it'd take several years of practicing for anyone to reach that potential. Lastly, we have perhaps the most controversial Spy unlock of all time, the Dead Ringer. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's start with the stats. Its faster cloak regen rate lets it fully recharge its cloak in 18.5 seconds, while its increased cloak drain rate meant cloaking with the Dead Ringer only lasted for 7 seconds. These two stats alone would make for a pretty boring unlock, but it's what's not listed in the stats that made the Dead Ringer so controversial. Rather than cloaking on demand like the other two watches, the Dead Ringer's cloak can only be activated by taking damage. Upon taking damage, a fake ragdoll corpse is dropped as the actual spy enters his cloak. You might be thinking that because this was released way back in 2009, surely the majority of players would have actually been fooled by this fake corpse. But oftentimes, Dead Ringer spies would be revealed by the very ragdolls that they were dropping. There were small inconsistencies with these ragdolls that made identifying a feigned death trivial. They would pathetically flop onto the ground, even if hit by an explosive. Spy might let out a severe pain sound after feigning a death on a small hit. His fake corpse might come with glitched items or cosmetics. Basically, something was clearly off about these fake ragdolls. And even if you were left wondering if the spy's death was real or not, players quickly found that they could check the fallen weapon to see if it replenished ammo, or even just press tab to see if the spy's username was actually grayed out from being killed. So no, the dead ringer had a hard time fooling anyone even back in 2009. But at the end of the day, that didn't matter, because people used the dead ringer for one thing and one thing only: to become invincible. On release, activating the dead ringer granted Spy immunity to cloak flickering, as well as a whopping 90% damage reduction from all damage he takes throughout the duration of his cloak, including whatever hit activated his cloak in the first place. This allowed a Spy to survive fully charged headshots, taunt kills, and even backstabs. Rather than trying to trick enemies with a feigned death, Spies were using the dead ringer to either brute force their way through a choke point, or to escape from an interaction that they'd otherwise die from. Even as far back as 2009, there were players criticizing the dead ringer as being a get-out-of-jail-free card. It should be noted that the dead ringer did not grant immunity to afterburn at this time, but as long as you steered clear of pyros, the dead ringer practically guaranteed that you'd travel as far as 7 seconds of cloak allowed for. Once those 7 seconds were up, however... Just like today, the main downside of the dead ringer was its loud, distinct decloak sound, which dissuaded Spies from trying to decloak right behind the enemy's backs. Because of this, the dead ringer was used more by Spies that preferred to use their revolvers rather than their knives. Decloaking with the dead ringer would also fully drain your cloak meter, even if you manually decloaked early. This actually wasn't the case until a few days after the weapon's release. Before that, players would essentially have infinite dead ringer uses if they manually decloaked as soon as possible. This was a harsh overcorrection on Valve's part, but thankfully they'd scale the cloak drain back drastically just 2 months later, in June. With this patch, manually decloaking with the dead ringer would only drain up to 40% instead of 100%. Its cloak could also now be regenerated with ammo, even when you're already invisible, although extending your cloak beyond the initial 7 seconds would remove your damage resistance and lack of flickering. This made the dead ringer incredibly easy to spam, especially on maps with large ammo packs, which would refill your charge to 100%. This same patch also gave a massive buff to Spy as a whole. While disguised, Spies would no longer be knocked back by the Force of Nature or Pyro's Air Blast. Not only that, but using Air Blast on a disguised Spy that was on fire would actually extinguish them. This was immediately reverted just 2 days later, but it showed that Valve was willing to make drastic changes in order to make Spy stronger. For the rest of 2009, Spy would continue to receive minor buffs, bug fixes, and quality of life improvements. In August, weapons with on-hit effects, like the healing of the Blutsauger or the Uber gain of the Ubersaw, were changed to no longer trigger when used against disguised Spies. Additionally, sapping a teleporter would now automatically place another sapper on the other end. With that, we've reached the end of 2009. While 2007 and 2008 were mostly about fixing bugs and oversights, this year was all about buffs, whether it be with solid new unlocks or quality of life improvements. The 3 new weapons released this year helped to flesh out Spy's playstyle without straying too far from his role as a sneaky assassin. The Cloak and Dagger was appreciated by Spy mains who preferred to wait for a key backstab pick, while the Ambassador and Dead Ringer were enjoyed by more aggressive players. And for those who wanted a mix of both playstyles, the stock Revolver and Invis Watch were still perfectly viable. "2010 kicks things off in January with an immediate nerf to the Dead Ringer. Decloaking early with the Dead Ringer now reduces cloak by at least 60%. The amount of cloak that you could gain from ammo packs was also capped at 35%. These two changes made it impossible to regain your Dead Ringer charge with a single ammo pack, giving the enemy team time to kill you for good. In the following week, Valve released a handful of fixes aimed at making feigned death via the Dead Ringer more believable. While these changes may have been enough to fool new players, I once again need to emphasize that even if the ragdoll of a feigned death was identical to that of a real death, which it still wasn't at this point, experienced players would have no trouble figuring out if the death was real or not. So even after these significant changes, the Dead Ringer was still largely the same, though the nerfs to its cloak recharge made deciding when to decloak require a bit more thought than before. But even if spy mains memorized every ammo kit location in order to effectively chain Dead Ringer activations, they had no way of bypassing the loud decloak sound that gave their location away. That is, until the Manconomy update of September. This update introduced two new unlocks for Spy, the L'étranger and the Your Eternal Reward. The L'étranger was, unfortunately, not very impressive upon its release. Its only upside was gaining 15% cloak on hit, which wasn't nearly enough to make up for its minus 20% damage penalty. It should come as no surprise that the L'étranger had no chance of competing with the stock revolver or the ambi. The Your Eternal Reward, being Spy's first knife unlock, was fittingly designed around using stealth and deception to secure backstabs. Just like today, backstabbing someone with the Your Eternal Reward would rapidly disguise you as whoever you just stabbed. Funnily enough, backstabbing Ubered players and Razorback snipers would also grant you their disguise due to an oversight in the code, though this was fixed just a week later. Additionally, any kills made with the Your Eternal Reward were silent. The victim wouldn't make a sound, their corpse would quickly disappear, and your kill wouldn't even appear in the kill feed to the enemy team. These two upsides made chaining multiple backstabs much easier against teams that weren't communicating effectively. The Your Eternal Reward removed two spy detecting tools that newer players had been using up to this point, keeping an eye on the kill feed and listening for the deaths of teammates. Being able to redisguise immediately after a backstab also made the Your Eternal Reward excellent at dismantling sentry nests. But of course, this all came at the cost of one major downside. Any spy using the Your Eternal Reward could not manually disguise. So although the Silent Killer attribute was incredibly potent in a pub setting, spies wouldn't be able to infiltrate the enemy team without getting that first disguise, which required both patience and luck. Looking just at these new unlocks, this update was extremely underwhelming for Spy. Neither the L'étranger nor the Your Eternal Reward could compete with the other options. However, this was not a mistake. Valve intentionally made these unlocks underpowered. Why? Because when these weapons were paired together, along with a familiar fez, it created something far greater than the sum of its parts, the Saharan Spy set. That's right, this is the update that introduced pay-to-win mechanics in the form of item sets, and the Saharan Spy set was among the most powerful. In exchange for an increased cloak flicker time, this set granted spies a quieter decloak sound. How much quieter? Enough to make even the Dead Ringer nearly silent. And speaking of the Dead Ringer, it was the perfect match for this set. The quieter decloak that the set granted nullified one of the biggest downsides of the Dead Ringer, and the Dead Ringer's lack of cloak flickering completely removed the only downside of the set. Really, the true downsides of this set were being stuck with using the L'étranger and Your Eternal Reward, but being able to use a nearly silent Dead Ringer was hard to pass up. 2010 was a relatively uneventful year for spy mains, despite receiving 2 new unlocks. The L'étranger and Your Eternal Reward were both underwhelming on their own. And although the Saharan spy set was undoubtedly strong, it was also inconsistent. So by the end of 2010, spy players were generally still using the same loadouts that they'd used in the previous year, with the Saharan spy set acting more as a fun but gimmicky playstyle to mess around with. That's alright though, because Valve was just warming up. The following year would be a much different story. By 2011, TF2 had already been out for over 3 years, and the player base had only gotten better at detecting spies. Experienced players knew that they could easily kill any spy so long as they never showed their backs. To them, any spy that they caught was a dead one. Or at least, that's what they thought. Because by 2011, spy mains were turning even the most aggressive spy checkers into backstab fodder by doing this. Trick stabs like the Matador and the Stair Stab had been known about for a while up to this point, but it wasn't until 2011 that these more advanced techniques began to go mainstream, with players like Stabby Stabby showing them off in montage videos. Not only were trick stabs flashy, but they also gave spies new options for dealing with enemies that were hunting them down. And perhaps Valve took notice of this growing trend, because in March of 2011, they'd release every trick-stabbing spy's favorite knife, the Conover's Kunai. The Kunai on release had the same upside of granting health on backstabs that it does today. But believe it or not, the Kunai was not nearly as popular as it is now. This is for a few reasons. Compared to today, its reduced health penalty was even greater, leaving Spy with only 60 health. The overheal you could gain via backstabs capped out at just 180 health. Lastly, there was no minimum health gain on kill, so backstabbing someone with 5 health would grant you a mere 5 health in return. The original iteration of the Kunai had greater risk for less reward. As such, it was rarely used, though its high-risk playstyle did attract spy mains that wanted to challenge themselves. The release of the Kunai made for the 3rd underwhelming spy unlock in a row, after the L'étranger and the Your Eternal Reward. It was beginning to look like Valve didn't know what direction to take spy in, and this struggle would only become more apparent just 3 months later, in the Uber update of June, where Valve decided to turn spy into a second scout. Wait, what? The Uber update introduced 2 new unlocks for Spy, with one of those being the Enforcer. On release, the Enforcer boasted a plus 20% damage bonus at all times, whether you were disguised or not, allowing it to deal up to 72 damage at max ramp up. That might not sound like a lot, but keep in mind how quickly revolvers fire and reload. The Enforcer could dish out a lot of damage. Enough damage, in fact, to 2-shot light classes, which previously could only be accomplished with the Ambassador's crit headshots. Meanwhile, critical hits with the Enforcer dealt 144 damage, 1-shotting light classes and 2-shotting everyone else other than heavy. This meant that an Enforcer spy was unironically a viable recipient for a Kritzkrieg Uber. So the Enforcer was strong, but surely it had a downside to keep it in check, right? I mean, even the Ambassador had a slow firing speed and a cooldown on headshots to compensate for its high potential damage. Well, the Enforcer had just one downside, a half-second increase to the time it took to inner cloak. This made sense, making a revolver that was more powerful, but made it harder for you to escape if you were outgunned. But here's the thing. This downside just flat out did not apply to the Dead Ringer. Just like how the sole downside of the Saharan Spy set, which was still in the game at this time, also did not apply to the Dead Ringer. There was literally no reason not to use the Enforcer over stock for spies using the Dead Ringer. And the Dead Ringer, as I mentioned earlier, already had great synergy with aggressive spies that preferred using their revolver more than their knife. The Enforcer was so strong on its own that spies using it didn't even need to bother with disguises or espionage to be effective. They could just gun people down head on. The same couldn't be said about the second new unlock of this update, however, the Big Earner. This thing was awful on release. It had the same crippling max health penalty that it does today, but its only upside was gaining 30% cloak on kill. It was really just a diet kunai. The risk was lower, but so was the reward, and as such it was rarely used. This update also marked TF2 becoming a free-to-play game, which led to a sudden influx of new players with zero knowledge on how to combat spies. It was like the experience of the overall player base was set back to 2008 levels overnight, which veteran spy mains were more than happy about, especially when they could use the kunai or the Saharan Spy set to exploit these new players to the fullest. With that being said, we're done with the Uber update, and just 2 months later, Spy would receive yet another new unlock, the Diamondback. Don't get too excited though, because while this weapon is controversial today, it was seen as yet another underwhelming and gimmicky unlock on release. Well, that's not entirely true. It was actually game-breaking on release due to an exploit that gave spies infinite crits. But as soon as that was patched 2 days later, the Diamondback was largely forgotten. It had the same damage penalty that it does today, and although it could store guaranteed critical hits, those crits would only be given for destroying buildings with your sapper. The fact that you could only gain crits if there happened to be an engineer with buildings on the other team made the Diamondback inherently situational, much like the Man-Melter, which was released just a few months later, curiously enough. And if you really wanted a more powerful revolver, you could just use the Enforcer. The Diamondback was, unsurprisingly, rarely used. Skipping ahead to December, Spy received his 5th and final unlock of the year, the Spycicle. This weapon was controversial from the very start, because it gave spies a way to bypass their long-time counter, Pyro. Getting hit by fire with the Spycicle active granted Spy 2 seconds of immunity to all fire damage, which was plenty of time for the Spy to take out his revolver and kill a Pyro from full health. This also caused the Dead Ringer to become even more infuriating to fight against. Up until this point, the most consistent way to punish a Dead Ringer spy had been to go Pyro and use your flamethrower after an obvious feigned death. Due to the shorter cloak duration of the Dead Ringer, the spy wouldn't have enough time to walk around the Pyro and find an ideal spot to decloak. But when combined with the Spycicle, Dead Ringer spies were practically unkillable, with a 90% resistance to all damage and 2 seconds of fire immunity on demand. Of course, using up your Spycicle came at a cost. Once consumed, it would melt and take 15 seconds to recharge. This was a notable downside, as it meant that even a single flame particle could stop you from getting an important backstab that you'd otherwise be willing to sacrifice yourself for. But even without his knife, Spy could still dish out a ton of damage with the Enforcer or the Ambassador. And wouldn't you know it, these revolvers also synergized well with the Dead Ringer. The Dead Ringer, Enforcer, and Spycicle were used together so often that the loadout was given its own name, Dr. Enforcicle. We're not even done with the Spycicle though, because on top of its fire immunity, it also had the Silent Killer attribute, which, if you recall from the Your Eternal Reward, made getting chain stabs much easier in an unorganized pub setting. You could argue that the Silent Killer attribute was cancelled out by the fact that your backstab victims were turned into ice, alerting the enemy team that a Spycicle spy was nearby. But most of the time when you encounter one of those ice statues, the spy that caused them was already long gone. And even if you did find him, there wasn't much stopping him from using his dead ringer to retreat to safety. Oh, and one last thing. Ever wonder why the Spycicle uses the revolver taunt and not the fencing taunt kill like every other knife has? Well, the Spycicle did have that taunt kill for about a week, until Valve saw people doing this. In 2011 changed a lot for Spy. Nearly half of all unlockable Spy weapons came from this year. Unfortunately, not all of those unlocks were winners. The Big Earner and Diamondback were simply not worth using, and even the kunai had its fair share of problems. On the flip side, this year also gave us the Enforcer and Spycicle, unlocks so powerful that they were arguably straight upgrades to stock. These weapons also encouraged spies to play less like a spy and more like a scout, foregoing disguises to shoot enemies head-on, and using the Cloak of the Dead Ringer for escaping from bad situations rather than getting into position for a key pick. Speaking of the Dead Ringer, usage for it continued to rise over the course of this year. It was already strong when it released back in 2009, but after the Saharan Spy set, the Enforcer, and the Spycicle, players were feeling like they had to use the Dead Ringer to be effective. So by the end of 2011, Spy was undoubtedly stronger than he was a year prior. But this strength came at the cost of making fighting Spy feel increasingly frustrating. From the very start of 2012, Valve was already testing nerfs for the Enforcer in TF2's beta. And in May of that year, the Enforcer received its first set of nerfs in the actual game. It was given 2 new penalties, a 20% slower firing speed and the removal of random crits. The slower firing speed was manageable, since the stock revolver already fires faster than the time it takes most players to readjust their aim. As for the removal of random crits, I've covered this in a previous video, but basically, it stopped Enforcer spies from dishing out the occasional hit scan, perfectly accurate 144 damage shot. Lastly, the Enforcer's 20% damage bonus was changed to only be active while the spy is undisguised. Just like with the slower firing speed, this also didn't change much. In fact, it only further encouraged spies to ditch using disguises altogether. So, although the Enforcer was nerfed, it was still a very strong choice for aggressive spies. The following month of June came with a new unlock, not for Spy, but for Scout, the Babyface's blaster. Prior to this weapon being released, Scout was often seen as one of the worst disguises to pick due to the obvious difference in run speed. But with the Babyface's blaster reducing the user's movement speed, a Scout that's running suspiciously slowly might actually just be a Scout, making disguising as Scout not as much of a dead giveaway as before. And from this point forward, Spy mains would realize that disguising as Scout isn't actually as bad as previously thought. Scout's smaller stature makes it easier for disguised spies to hide in plain sight, and spies disguised as Scout are more difficult to headshot due to the mismatch between the Scout's model and the spy's actual head hitbox. A Scout's tendency to weave in and out of battle also makes seeing a Scout that wasn't there a second ago less suspicious than, say, a demo man. Skipping ahead 1 month yet again brings us to August with another new unlock, and this time it's actually for the spy. That unlock was the Red Tape Recorder. It's crazy that it took Valve 5 years to make an unlock for the Sapper. So, was it worth the wait? Sadly, the Red Tape Recorder on release functioned the same as it does today, with the ability to reverse building construction in exchange for a minus 100% damage penalty. It's not very good, although being able to de-level buildings is at least interesting. Players have often argued that the Red Tape Recorder is good at countering mini-sentries, since minis being sapped by the Red Tape Recorder takes 10 seconds to be destroyed. But you could also just sap the mini with a regular sapper and kill the engineer yourself. And so, immediately after its release, the Red Tape Recorder quietly joined the growing collection of mediocre spy weapons. Surely Valve will make up for this by releasing another broken spy unlock like the Enforcer, right? No, actually, the Red Tape Recorder was the last spy unlock to be added to the game, not counting any reskins. With Spy's kit now being complete, Valve decided to take a break from rebalancing for the next 11 months. Over this time, they'd sit back and observe what loadout spy players were equipping and how they were using them. What were the results, you ask? Well, Valve ended their spy rebalancing hiatus in July of 2013, with a blog post detailing some of the changes they'd been making in the next update. It was this blog post that confirmed what players had been saying for years, that the Dead Ringer was a big problem. It was the most equipped Invis watch by far. Take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and come up with your best guess as to what percentage of spies were using the Dead Ringer. Got it? 80%. 80% of all spy players were using the Dead Ringer. To put that into perspective, if you randomly selected 10 spy players, 8 of them would have the Dead Ringer equipped, with the remaining 2 using either the Cloak and Dagger or stock. This blog post went on to also talk about item sets and how much of a, in Valve's own words, balancing nightmare they'd been. And so, 2 days later, both the Dead Ringer and the Saharan Spy set were nerfed. As of this patch, damaging a spy that was cloaked with the Dead Ringer would reduce the duration of the Dead Ringer's damage resistance and lack of flickering. This change meant that heavily spammed choke points could now be too much for even the Dead Ringer to infiltrate. As for one-on-one engagements, skilled players could now predict a Dead Ringer spy's movement and kill him mid-cloak, rather than needing to wait for his cloak to run out, although this prediction was much easier said than done. On the bright side, disguising as a teammate with the Dead Ringer would now drop the body of the player the spy was disguised as. This could actually be used to fool even more experienced players, since they aren't as likely to check for a Dead Ringer spy after killing what seems to be a clueless new player. As for the Saharan Spy set, its set bonuses were removed entirely and replaced with a new taunt effect, which was really the predecessor to unusual taunts if you think about it. This could also be seen as a nerf to the Dead Ringer, as it was no longer possible to avoid the loud decloak noise that would often get spies caught. To compensate for the removal of the set's bonuses, one of the weapons within the set, the L'Étranger, was given a new perk of a 40% longer cloak duration at all times. This was a massive buff, as it allowed spies that didn't use their revolvers much in the first place to better traverse the map and position themselves for backstabs. In retrospect, the Saharan Spy set nerf was really a buff to spy overall, due entirely to how useful the L'Étranger suddenly became. By this point in the game's life, disguises weren't fooling experienced players for more than a few seconds. This meant that for spies that still wanted to infiltrate enemy lines and go for backstabs, they'd need to hide in their cloak until the enemy was distracted, which the L'Étranger was perfect for. After this patch, there was only one spy revolver left that was seen by most to be a downgrade, the Diamondback. And so 5 months later, in December, Valve took a crack at buffing it as well. This is the moment where the Diamondback we all know and love, or hate, was born, with it now granting guaranteed crits with backstab kills in addition to destroyed buildings. This at least eliminated the previous issue of the Diamondback being situational. There was no shortage of strong revolvers at this point in the game's life between the Enforcer and the Ambassador, the latter of which could deal the same 102 damage critical hits. But while the Ambassador required precise aiming to achieve those critical hits, the Diamondback rewarded spies with guaranteed crits for just doing their job, a criticism that players were bringing up the day this update dropped. In any case, the Diamondback was finally viable, though whether or not it was better than the Enforcer or the Ambassador was up for debate. 2012 and 2013 especially have marked a sudden shift in Valve's balancing philosophy for Spy. The years before these were all about filling Spy's kit with unlocks that were either too strong or not strong enough. Now, Valve's focus is on reducing the parts of Spy that make him frustrating to fight against, and compensating with quality of life improvements and buffs to previously outclassed weapons. The Dead Ringer still has its absurd resistances, but now your enemies at least have the opportunity to outplay you. The old Saharan Spy set eliminated one of the Dead Ringer's main drawbacks with its loud decloak, whereas the new L'Étranger simply extends your cloak's duration. In short, Valve is slowly but surely making Spy more fun to play as and against. Of course, there was still work left to do. The Dead Ringer was still controversial even after its nerf, as well as the Enforcer and now the Diamondback. After 2013, Valve would take yet another hiatus from Spy rebalances. 2014 came and went without any major changes, which brings us to 2015. This was a huge year for balance changes, as Valve was trying to prepare TF2 for the release of competitive matchmaking. So what did that mean for Spy, who has always been considered by many to be the worst class in competitive play? Well, the year starts off in February with a Diamondback exploit fix. After being buffed to grant crits upon backstabs back in December of 2013, the Diamondback would also grant crits if a backstab was successful but didn't kill someone, like versus an Ubered player or a sniper using the Razorback. This was the same exact oversight that the Your Eternal Reward had on its release. But while that only took Valve a week to fix, this one remained in the game for over a year, which just goes to show that Valve doesn't always learn from their mistakes. And with that out of the way, we arrive at the Gunmetal update. This was a massive update for Spy, with Valve giving him a long list of buffs as well as nerfs. The question is, will Spy be any better or worse off after this update? Let's jump right in and find out. Starting with a handful of quality of life improvements to Spy himself. Changing to a new disguise while already disguised now takes just half a second, encouraging Spies to change their disguise as they traverse the map to better blend in. Spy's cloak was buffed to grant 20% damage resistance and a reduced timer on debuffs like fire and Jarate while invisible. This made the stock Invis Watch and the Cloak and Dagger better at crossing busy areas or escaping, bringing them closer to the Dead Ringer's capabilities. The passive resistance that sapped sentries have against revolvers was cut in half, dropping from 66% to 33%. And Spy's revolver reload animation was changed to no longer block your crosshair. Moving on to Spy's unlocks, the Cloak and Dagger received a small buff, with it now replenishing cloak upon ammo pickups while visible, albeit at a reduced rate when compared to stock. The Big Earner, which had previously been seen as one of the worst knives in the game, was buffed to grant a 3-second speed boost on kill. Not only did this change fit the weapon's original intention of assisting in an escape, but it also opened up new opportunities for chain stabs. The health penalty was still an issue, of course. 100 health puts you at risk of being one-shot by a handful of commonly used weapons, but for the first time, that risk felt worth taking for many Spy players. But the biggest winner of this update was the Kunai. The health penalty was reduced to minus 55 health, leaving Spy at 70 health rather than 60. The maximum overheal from the Kunai was also increased to 210, allowing Spies to tank even more hits, most notably random crits from melee weapons. Lastly, the Kunai was given a minimum health gain of 75 health on kill, even if your target had less than 75 health remaining. This is the Kunai that we're familiar with today, and is leagues better than the unreliable gimmick that it was originally perceived as. The Spysicle, which had previously granted Spies 2 seconds of full fire immunity, would now grant 1 second of fire immunity and 10 seconds of afterburn immunity. This change meant that spies could no longer abuse their fire immunity to kill pyros from full health with their revolver, which, in retrospect, was pretty ridiculous. The silent killer attribute, which had always seemed like a random addition to the weapon, was also removed. Lastly, the Spycicle could now be recharged more quickly via ammo pickups. All in all, the Spycicle was still a solid choice for spies wanting to flee from pyros, only now it was less frustrating to fight against. The Enforcer, which was still dominant after its first nerf back in 2012, was nerfed yet again. But while the previous nerf contained a handful of small tweaks that ultimately didn't change much, this nerf brought with it one single change that would completely ruin the weapon. Its 20% damage bonus while undisguised was changed to a damage bonus while disguised. And because you lose your disguise after firing any revolver, this meant that the Enforcer would only have its damage bonus active for a single shot, and would suffer from its slower firing speed for every subsequent shot. Spy players quickly discovered that they could keep the damage bonus by spamming their redisguise button between shots, but once that was patched out in August, the Enforcer would be looked down on as the revolver for spies that wanted to two-shot light classes without needing to aim with the Ambassador. Last, but certainly not least, we have the Dead Ringer. Just like with the Enforcer, the Dead Ringer had also received a nerf a few years prior that ultimately didn't change much. So seeing the Dead Ringer show up in a balance patch yet again led most players to assume that Valve was trying to kill the Dead Ringer once and for all. Looking at the changes made, the majority of them were undoubtedly nerfs. First and foremost, the notorious 90% damage resistance was slashed nearly in half, dropping down to a 50% resistance to the attack that triggered the Dead Ringer. Once cloaked, the Spy only had 3 seconds of dwindling resistances and immunity to cloak flickering until they were left with normal invisibility conditions for the remainder of the cloak, which couldn't even be extended with ammo anymore. The amount of cloak lost upon activating the Dead Ringer and its cloak regeneration were tweaked as well, but the nerf that everyone talked about was the reduced damage resistance. Among these obvious nerfs, however, were 3 major buffs, 2 of which weren't even mentioned in the patch notes. As of this update, activating the Dead Ringer would now grant Spy with a speed boost as well as immunity to Afterburn for the first 3 seconds. The addition of the Afterburn immunity felt so random that players actually thought it was a bug at first. The 35% cap on cloak recharge from ammo boxes, which was added way back in 2010, was changed to minus 35% cloak received from ammo. This meant that large ammo boxes would now replenish 65% of the Dead Ringer's charge, rather than being capped at 35% like before. These 3 changes, all of which being major buffs, meant that players were unsure whether the Dead Ringer had actually been nerfed or not. The majority of the player base seemed to think that the Dead Ringer was dead for good, but Spy mains were not convinced. They'd need a bit more time to experiment with the weapon before reaching any conclusions. Gunmetal, like I said before, was a massive update for Spy, so let's recap the major changes that were made. Spy received a handful of quality of life improvements. The Cloak and Dagger, Big Earner, and Kunai all received buffs that put them on par with the other unlocks, while the Spycicle was scaled back and the Enforcer was nerfed into the ground. As for the Dead Ringer, discussion on whether it had truly been nerfed or not would continue over the next few months. Those who argued that the Dead Ringer had been nerfed pointed to its resistances being cut by nearly half, and that was true, for about 5 months, because 5 months after the Gunmetal update came Tough Break in December. This update brought yet another quality of life improvement for Spy players. Sentries would now remain disabled for half a second after being unsapped, giving Spies time to sap it again or flee. This was also the update that added outlines to teammates and the objective upon respawning, which had the unfortunate side effect of revealing disguised spies. But other than that, Tough Break bestowed Spy players with one simple buff. The initial damage resistance of the Dead Ringer was increased from 50% to 75%. This change made activating the Dead Ringer in the middle of a fight much easier, albeit less so than with the original 90% resistance. But with the newly added speed boost, the Dead Ringer was now even better upon activation than it had been before. Prior to Gunmetal, before the Dead Ringer gained the speed boost, experienced players had figured out that after activating an obvious Dead Ringer Spy's cloak, they could just fall back for the next 7 seconds and listen for that loud decloak sound to find and kill the Spy for good. If the Spy picked up ammo to extend their cloak, that would only reveal their position to the enemies that were already aware of the Spy's presence. In short, activating the old Dead Ringer was easy, but finding a safe place to decloak against good players was not. With the addition of the speed boost, however, this was no longer the case. It didn't matter if your Dead Ringer activation was painfully obvious, because you could be anywhere on the map by the time you decloak, making it much harder for your enemies to hunt you down. And if the Spy fell back to one of the many ammo sources scattered throughout the map, they could have their Dead Ringer recharged within seconds, if not instantly in the case of a large ammo pack. With all that being said, was the Dead Ringer actually better than its pre-Gunmetal counterpart? It's hard to say, but it certainly wasn't dead like many people initially thought. It was almost as if the Dead Ringer had feigned its own death. "2015 had a ton of balance changes, though the majority of them were in Gunmetal. And Valve's balancing philosophy for Spy has remained the same, to compensate for any nerfs by buffing underpowered weapons and giving Spy quality of life improvements. But for the first time, we've seen Valve nerf a weapon too hard in the case of the Enforcer. And if Valve's goal for the Dead Ringer was to make it less frustrating to fight against, then they clearly missed the mark. We've only got a few major changes left to cover, so let's hope that Valve ends things on a high note. Skipping ahead to April of 2016, Valve got around to fixing a Dead Ringer bug that had been in the game for the past year or two. This bug caused the feigned corpse of a Dead Ringer Spy to turn into what was lovingly dubbed the Croissant Spy, which was not only hilarious, but also made it obvious that the Spy had feigned his death. Of course, even after this fix, most players had no trouble telling whether a Spy's death was feigned or not, but it's still worth mentioning. 3 months later, Valve would release the long-awaited Meet Your Match update. With this update, Spy was given a massive buff that people had been requesting for years. His max run speed was increased from 100% to 107%, now tying with Medic for the second fastest class in the game. This single change opened up so many new opportunities for Spy, the most obvious being that he could now catch up to the remaining 100% move speed classes for a backstab. It made disguising as Scout more appealing, since doing so wouldn't reduce your run speed like with most other disguises. The Big Earner was now even better at chain stabbing, with its speed boost making Spy noticeably faster than Scout. And yes, that means that the Dead Ringer was even more frustrating, because now not even Scouts can chase you down for those first 3 seconds. That's not all for Spy though, because this update also came with a buff for the Enforcer, which had been dead since Gunmetal in the previous year. So what did Valve do to try and salvage the weapon? They made its attacks pierce resistances. This change alone was baffling enough, but the worst part is that it didn't even work most of the time. A lot of the weapons that could resist bullet damage continued to do so against the Enforcer. And so, surprising absolutely nobody, the Enforcer would remain as Spy's worst revolver. That's okay though, because the loss of the Enforcer did not mean the end of the aggressive, revolver-focused playstyle that it had once enabled. Most Spy mains that were using the Enforcer in its prime simply switched to the Ambassador after Gunmetal. And although the Ambassador had a much higher skill floor than the original Enforcer, it also had a much higher skill ceiling, meaning the Ambassador could potentially be even more powerful in the right hands. As a result of the numerous balance changes over the years leading up to Meet Your Match, two distinct playstyles had emerged for Spy: Gun Spy and Knife Spy. Gun Spies primarily used the Ambassador or stock revolver paired with the Dead Ringer, while Knife Spies used the L'Étranger and knives like the Kunai and the Big Earner. Players could also mix and match different weapons to achieve a blend of both playstyles. Gun Spy may have been the superior option back when the Dr. Enforcical loadout was around, but a lot has changed since then. Aside from the Dead Ringer being as brainless as ever to use, Spy's kit was more balanced at this point than it had been for years. This sense of balance wouldn't last for much longer though. A year after Meet Your Match, in June of 2017, Valve released a blog post outlining their proposed balance changes for the upcoming Pyro update. 3 of Spy's unlocks were on the chopping block, 2 of which, the Dead Ringer and the Your Eternal Reward, were no-brainers. The former had been causing frustration for years despite several nerfs and reworks, while the latter was rarely used and in need of a buff ever since the removal of the Saharan Spy set bonuses back in 2012. But the third unlock, which was proposed to be nerfed alongside the Dead Ringer, came completely out of left field: the Ambassador. To the majority of Spy mains, this was shocking. The Ambassador hadn't been touched for over 8 years up to this point. Why was Valve suddenly trying to nerf it now? In the blog post, Valve explained that their problem with the Ambassador was that it allowed Spy to get headshot kills from across the map. This was reasonable. Spy being able to cloak to far off parts of the map and snipe the enemy team was incredibly hard to punish in pubs. But in a more competitive setting, consistently landing headshots with the Ambassador at any range was something that only the best Spy mains could achieve. And in that more competitive setting, the Ambi was oftentimes the only way that Spy players could meaningfully contribute to a match other than calling out information. Going for a backstab is always a gamble, especially versus experienced players. The Ambi, unlike the knives, didn't rely on any luck, just pure mechanical skill. Backstabs still had their place in competitive matches, but the Ambassador was generally more consistent. I had said with the weapon's release back in 2009 that the Ambassador's need for precision meant that it was used for picking off individuals rather than gunning down a group of enemies head-on. By 2017, this was still true for the vast majority of players. But there were indeed some Spy mains that had gotten so good with the Ambi that they played more like a scout-sniper hybrid in a manner reminiscent of the original Enforcer. The question of whether or not to nerf the Ambassador was emblematic of the struggle that Valve has had with Spy since day one. Should Spy have a tool that lets him defeat experienced players? Even if said tool deviates from the class's identity of deception and infiltration? Even if it makes Spy destroy newer players more than he already does? There's no single right answer to this. But if Valve was to nerf the Ambassador, they would ideally need to strike the perfect balance, to change it in a way that makes it harder to pub stomp with, while letting it remain viable in competitive matches. So, what was Valve's proposed nerf? To add bullet spread. Oh my god, no. This was a terrible idea. Why would you add bullet spread to a weapon that has such little room for error? All Spy mains could do was send their feedback to Valve and hope that they listened. Four months later, in October of 2017, the Jungle Inferno update would finally drop. Just as Valve had said in their blog post, Spy was given 2 nerfs, one to the Dead Ringer and one to the Ambassador. A dead ringer nerf was almost universally agreed to be necessary, and the nerf that Valve went with was the same nerf that they had proposed back in June. The dead ringer would no longer be able to regain its charge via ammo. This made the dead ringer much less spammable, which was a welcome change. As for the ambassador, it seemed that Valve actually listened to the community's feedback. They scrapped their proposed nerf of adding random bullet spread to every shot. Instead, the ambassador's headshot damage would now be affected by falloff, meaning that it would deal less damage at greater ranges. Any headshots beyond 1,200 hammer units would simply register as if it was a body shot. Spy mains were initially relieved that the bullet spread nerf had been scrapped, but upon booting up the game once the update became available to play, they were disappointed, to say the least. 1,200 hammer units turned out to not be as far as it sounds, and the damage falloff made headshots even at mid-range do about as much as splash damage from a rocket. The ambassador was now only a threat at close range, which is also the distance where the stock revolver excels at dealing damage while requiring much less aim. 8 years after its release, the ambassador was suddenly dethroned from its spot as the de facto gun spy revolver, just like the enforcer back in 2015. But unlike the enforcer, the ambi was a revolver that raised the skill ceiling for spy exponentially. This was a weapon that some spy mains had poured thousands of hours into practicing. Whether or not the ambassador was deserving of some nerf is still up for debate. But even if it did need a nerf, the one it received was way too harsh. There was no reason to use the ambassador anymore, other than for fun. And with both the ambi and the enforcer gone, this meant that for the gunspy playstyle, the Diamondback was left without any competition aside from stock. This was the revolver that could deal the same long-range 102 damage shots that Valve argued were problematic, but with even less aim required. The fact that the Diamondback was still allowed to do the very thing that the ambassador was nerfed into the ground for felt like a slap in the face. The ambassador, along with the dead ringer, had been Spy's most consistently strong unlock since 2009. But with this single update, both weapons were knocked down several pegs. We're not done with Jungle Inferno though, so surely Valve included plenty of buffs for Spy to balance out these harsh nerfs, right? Well, the only other Spy weapon to see any changes was the Your Eternal Reward, which was reworked to allow for manual disguising for the first time. This came at the cost of manual disguises consuming your full cloak meter, and an increased cloak drain rate on top of that. These changes made the Your Eternal Reward a lot more consistent. The original hurdle of needing to obtain that initial disguise was gone, and backstabbing a slow class like Heavy no longer meant that you had to either stick with a bad disguise or lose it. In the context of Spy's kit as a whole, however, the new Your Eternal Reward didn't add much. This weapon has always been great at getting chain stabs in unorganized pubs, but it now has to compete for this niche with the kunai and the big earner, both of which can lead to chain stabs even against more organized teams. The Your Eternal Reward is still a lot of fun to use, and this rework definitely made it more consistent overall, but it just wasn't enough to balance out the loss of the ambassador. As for quality of life improvements, Spy didn't receive any directly, although he did benefit from some changes made to Pyro. Before Jungle Inferno, getting hit by even a single flame particle would deal a full 10 seconds of afterburn, making it nearly impossible for an ignited Spy to escape. Now, the duration of afterburn depends on how long the target was in direct contact with the flame, meaning Spies may only have to deal with as little as 3 seconds of afterburn, which can be reduced even further by cloaking. Additionally, the visuals of all flamethrowers were updated to actually match the flame particles, making dodging flames as Spy not feel completely luck-based like before. Like with the Your Eternal Reward, these were undoubtedly great changes, But Jungle Inferno was the first major update where the nerfs for Spy outweighed the buffs. Past Jungle Inferno, there's only been one change worth noting, to the Enforcer of all things, which simply had its resistance-piercing property fixed in the Blue Moon update of March 2018. Being able to pierce the Wrangler's shield is nice, but it still doesn't bypass that hidden damage penalty that revolvers have against sapped sentries. Needless to say, the Enforcer would remain as one of Spy's weakest unlocks. And after over 14 years of new unlocks and balance changes, this is the state that Spy remains in today. So how has Spy evolved since TF2's release back in 07? From the very start, Spy has always excelled at punishing newer players for their lack of awareness. As time has gone on, however, spy checking and other anti-spy tactics have only gotten more common, aside from when the game went free-to-play in 2011. This increase in experience has made getting backstabs more difficult, which in turn forced spy players to adapt, whether that be with trick stabs or more effective use of their revolvers. Unlocks like the Dead Ringer, the Ambassador, and later the Enforcer further encouraged heavy revolver use, to the point that playing Spy felt less like himself and more like a scout or a sniper with a get-out-of-jail-free card. Valve chipped away at this issue by nerfing the Enforcer and reworking the Dead Ringer. They buffed several of Spy's previously underwhelming knife unlocks and gave Spy's cloak a damage resistance and reduced debuff timer, which brought Knife Spy much closer to Gun Spy in terms of effectiveness. Ultimately, however, Valve decided in Jungle Inferno to kill the Ambassador, and with it, the most extreme version of the Gun Spy playstyle. Oh, and the Red Tape Recorder has consistently been the best Sapper unlock in the game. This class, like any other, has been through both highs and lows over the years. Is Spy today more balanced than he's been in the past? Rather than give my opinion, I'd like you to reach your own conclusion and share it in the comments. What would you change about Spy, if anything? Just remember to be civil, please. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. I wouldn't have put so much effort into a project like this if it wasn't for the immense support that I've received from my previous videos. I plan on making a video like this for the rest of the mercs, as well as other smaller but still mildly interesting topics, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. I've also made a Patreon if you want to support the channel even further. Like I said, I wouldn't have the motivation to make large projects like this if it wasn't for the incredible support that I've gotten, so once again, thank you.